Welcome to another version of the Traditions of a Vermont Ridge Runner. I'm your host, Mike Canty, and we have a very special guest that came all the way down from northern Vermont today to be with us. He is the head biologist, waterfowl biologist for the state of Vermont, and I want to welcome Dave Sawsville, and thanks for coming, Dave.
Morning.
Morning. We're going to start out with Dave, and we're going to find out a little background information first, where you were born and raised and some of your schooling and educational background.
Well, I grew up down in Bennington, went to high school down in Mount Anthony, and from there I went to University of Vermont to study wildlife management and forestry. After that, left the state for a number of years. I think I'd gone for about 10 years and worked around the nation in various biologist jobs.
Great, so you're really a native Vermonter through and through, it sounds like. Even the education was here.
Yes.
That's great.
Absolutely.
Not too many of us left, Dave. I'm a fifth generation Vermonter, but anyway, I think we'll start in just by talking about the rules and regs first. We're going to emphasize waterfowl hunting today in our 30-minute show. There's a general Vermont hunting guide that will emphasize small game, large game, animals, big game, which is good. But there's another facet to the waterfowl hunting. Since they are usually under federal and state regs, there's a syllabus out there that whenever you go out and buy your federal duck stamp, they're available. They're also available online at the Fish and Wildlife website. And I'm going to have Dave tell us a little bit more about the details on the syllabus there.
Okay. Well, the syllabus we create every year, and it's production of all the states within the flyaway meeting together and the federal government, and the rules are set and actually recorded in the Federal Register. And then we put this out. The state can be more strict than the federal government, but not more lenient. And the process occurs. We'll start having public meetings in the early spring. We start formulating suggestions in December, January, and then we bring that forward to the public and they make comments, and we bring it to the board, and our final rules are set each April, and then we produce what we call the waterfowl syllabus, and it has the seasons for ducks, geese, any other migratory birds such as brant, common snipe, which is called the Wilson snipe now, and woodcock.
Great.
And then the public, that's available to them both on hard copy at a lot of your post offices and sporting goods shops or online at the website.
Well, that's good. That's a good summary of that syllabus. Very valuable. I carry one in my pocket. I have a couple in my glove box. It gives you the legal shooting hours each day of the season, too, and it's really a valuable thing to have. The other thing I want to tip my hat to is you guys in the Wildlife Board also. They do take these public hearings seriously. There's usually one in Whitehall and one up north in the Burlington area. In the
Essex Junction area, and then we've had one in various parts of the state. We've tried them in Newport, over in White River Junction.
Oh, good.
And we had one down in Bennington this year, trying to just get scattered around the state for different people.
And the reason for complimenting that is they do listen to the hunters' input, and I know that like every 2 years in a row it opens on a Wednesday, our waterfowl season, and every third year it opens on a Saturday.
Correct.
Correct. And that came pretty much, if I understand it, from hunter surveys and polls.
Correct. And we just completed one about 2 years ago that we're using those comments. It was a random sample of hunters by their HIP number and sent it out, and use that as information to make suggestions.
Okay, good. That HIP number that Dave just referred to, when you buy your license, and by the way, I'm in my fourth year now of a permanent license, so that might give you a clue on what a young feller I am. But anyway, when you buy those, I've got everything in a muzzleloader, the whole works. You do have to buy a federal stamp, and you have to sign across the face, and usually you get those at post offices and a lot of sporting goods stores. And along with that, you can get this online, but there's a stamp or seal with the Vermont State seal there too for your stamp. So those are some of the ingredients. And just below that, the HIP program, and that stands for Harvest Information Program. And it'll ask you, I believe, about the previous year.
Correct.
And like how many, maybe if you didn't hunt waterfowl, you check it, or how many ducks you got, 0 through 10, 11 through 20, how many geese you got, woodcock, and so forth. So it gives some valuable information to the biologists too, and how many people are out there hunting seriously.
And
good.
I mentioned on that HIP program is we use that as a sample and send more detailed requests to people to submit wings of the harvested birds or to track a daily diary of their hunting activity for waterfowl or woodcock, things like that.
Right, okay. And while we're talking about the research, how about explaining what these metal aluminum bands are all about there, if you could?
Well, the bands that we have on this lanyard, they're different sizes, and what they are is what we call pre-season band waterfowl. So we will trap geese when they're flightless in June and July, and we'll place them on their leg, and they have an individual number where we can track them. And what we do when we capture them is we age the birds, we sex the birds, and with waterfowl, obviously we tell the different types of waterfowl that they are. It could be a wood duck, a mallard, or a teal are very common around here. And what happens is if somebody finds a bird dead, or if somebody harvests one during the hunting season, there's a website on there now. We've gone to straight websites. It used to have a 1-800 number on it or an address, but they've eliminated that. And so it's just a website, and people record where they harvested the bird, where they found the bird, the town, general marsh. You can be as specific as you want. Now on the website you can pinpoint on a map where it is, and that gives us information on survival rates, harvest rates, age ratios, a lot of the information that we put into our models to estimate what the harvest is, and then gives us population estimates, and we can adjust the seasons up or down by using that information.
Yeah, I've collected a few over the years of my waterfowl hunting, some different sizes, like you say, goose size, a medium, it's usually mallard. I think one of them belongs even to a snow goose there.
Probably a 7 or 8. And what you can do is look on there, and it'll tell you right on the bottom. Last number on the prefix is the size of the band.
Okay.
And that
Good.
can get you there. Yeah.
Good. Maybe at this point, Dave, could you show us some of the natural history and some of the flyways and so forth of some of the waterfowl we deal with?
All right. Well, administratively, we break ourselves up into 4 flyways going across from ours, which is the Atlantic, goes from the Providences in Canada all the way down through to Florida and Georgia. And then we work our way west, Mississippi, Central, and Pacific. And what we use those for is to set the seasons, and twice a year, the biologists from all the states and provinces get together and discuss the research that's going on, future research that we want to do, how we're going to fund these activities, and also what the hunting seasons we would like to recommend and put out there. And then from our recommendations, it goes to the national level, what they call the Service Regulatory Committee, and they make the final decisions, and they send them back to the states to administer. So that's the administrative portion of it. It doesn't line up, obviously in nature that way.
Yeah, usually when a goose is up there about 1,000 feet, they don't see the boundaries.
Right. They're going to their normal patterns, and kind of this map shows a little differently. They use these bands to track where the birds were harvested and where they were captured originally. And you can see in the Atlantic flyway, we get most of our birds from the northeast provinces and our own area. But down, once you hit the Chesapeake Bay area, we get some birds from the Great Lakes and the Mississippi and Central flyway.
So a little bit from west to east at that point?
Correct. There's some merging of the populations, and we have to take that into account when you're managing the birds and their populations.
On that west to east, that's interesting. Is there any 1 or 2 species that primarily make that west to east?
We get canvasbacks and some of our pintails from the Midwest, and then in the Carolina states, North and South Carolinas, they get a number of their mallards from the Great Lakes population.
They do?
So
they don't go just due south a lot of times?
No, not at all. They follow water bodies, ridges of mountains, but they're following traditional routes where they have gone for areas that are good for feed during the wintertime. Obviously, we freeze up, and the birds will stay here as long as they have open water and open fields to find food on. So.
Good, very good. Why don't we mention a couple of minutes here now about the Vermont residential or local bird season for Canada geese, which is the month of September. And tell us a little bit about what brought that about in the first place.
I guess that's one thing that we should mention, is that we're managing on the population level. So the birds that we receive are, our migrants are from the Ungava Bay region, and they come through usually starting in early October and through November. And we manage those as one group of birds, whereas our resident population, which is here pretty much now from March through December, those are birds that nest here. They have their young brought up here, and they usually only migrate down to Massachusetts and New Jersey, Pennsylvania area, whereas our migrants go down into the Chesapeake Bay area. And what brought about the different seasons is we can hunt the resident birds from September 1 to the 25th, and then we stop that because we're trying to protect the birds migrating down from up north. But we had to open a season because there's so many of them that were produced in the area.
Right.
And we're having damages on lakefront properties, cropland, golf courses, even on you know, a lot of ponds and parks. People, you know, are having too many birds.
Right.
So we were able to have a much more liberal season, 25 days, and we allow 8 birds per day. Whereas in the migrant season, currently it's a 50-day season, but you're only allowed 3 birds per day. So we're adjusting what we're trying to do by the migrant birds. We're trying to stabilize to increase, whereas the resident birds are actually trying to decrease the numbers. And we can do that by number of days allowed and number of birds per day harvested.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. And by the way, when we're taping today with Dave, we're in the 3rd day of our waterfowl season in Vermont, Monday, October 15th, just to give you a little landmark there. And going back to golf courses for a minute, David and I were talking about before we taped today, my experience in September. I got some calls from groundskeepers or a golf pro or 2 or whatever at different golf courses, 3 of them to be exact. They end up getting 8 birds, harvesting 8 during the September season, and they all came from golf courses. They do leave quite a mess behind, that's for sure. And the golfers usually aren't very pleased with them. I believe 10, 15 years ago, they were kind of, you know, nice to look at, and then it was too much of a good thing when they really started to multiply. So you're saying earlier that our population is generally in Vermont, through tracing the bands and hunter information, southern New England down in New Jersey, usually they'll overwinter?
Correct.
Okay.
Right. You can track them with the bands as they return going down through, a lot of times they'll follow the Hudson River, the Susquehanna River, through Pennsylvania, and then they find that they winter quite often down in, like I said, Massachusetts and New Jersey is a big spot. And the birds, I often have people call me asking why there's a second migration in the springtime, because they have that big push that comes through at first. Yeah. And any of the birds that don't breed, the Canada geese don't breed until they're 3 years old. So all what we call the non-breeders, often you'll see them in June leaving the state, and they fly back up into the Arctic of Canada and the Ungava Bay area. And we were able to follow that with satellite transmitters, a couple of birds that we were able to tag on the nest. And so that they do, you know, use the same areas and interchange, but you can pattern them and when they're coming through for control measures.
So it may confuse some people or bird watchers, and you probably get a few calls on that too, that like almost a second migration?
Correct. It's very common in June for us to get calls wondering why the geese are migrating again. So, but because they look exactly the same. They're the same birds, they're not going to the north to nest anymore.
Okay. Good. Why don't we talk about some of the different varieties of waterfowl you brought in, Dave, today? These are taxidermy models, and let's start with maybe the divers first.
Okay.
Thanks.
Right. And we do have quite the variety. There's primarily 15 very common ones that people see, but we'll have, I don't know, 30 plus of the species, 45 species that are in the region show up here. But this first one is a diver. And you can see the bill is a little different than what you're used to seeing on a mallard. It's narrow and skinny, which is good for capturing fish when they dive after them. And divers, this is a hooded merganser, it's a drake, a very plain looking bird to many people, but it's the black and white, which is I find very attractive on a bird. But on a diving duck, the legs are back further on the body, so that they're adapted to tipping themselves up and diving down deeper into the water. So that's a very common one that you see in the state, and it also nests in tree cavities, which is unusual for a lot of ducks. Everybody thinks about them nesting on the ground. So that's the hooded merganser.
Okay.
And the next one is another one that's common to be seen in the state, nests mostly in bog areas. Up in the Northeast Kingdom we have a few of them, and that's called the ringneck duck.
Okay.
Usually sometimes you'll see a light ring around its neck, but they actually get confused. They have a ring around the bill. Oh, okay. So that's the ringneck duck. Very common, one of the higher number of harvested birds in the fall that come through, and people shoot them quite often. And then the last one that you have there, if you hold up, is you see on many of your larger lakes, and you can see the bill is a little bit different than the hooded merganser from the beginning, but it has a more stout bill. They dive down in and they feed on mussels and vegetation and things like that. But that's the common merganser. I'm sorry, not common merganser, common goldeneye. Okay. And very common on Lake Champlain, Lake Memphremagog, and some of your bigger lakes. And people target them later in the season, usually late October is the early time, and people will hunt them right through into December. They're a very hardy bird, and use the big open waters and come through in flocks there.
I can remember years and years ago, my father and my uncle Bob Franzoni would hunt these, believe it or not, on Bombazine after the Vermont rifle deer season. There was still some open pockets, and they used to set up on Rabbit Island and set their decoys up. And it was like probably early or mid-December then. There was no muzzleloader back then.
It's very cold that time of year, and obviously different conditions and different
Open water.
activities going on. Right.
Good.
So they're primarily, like I said, they're designed to dive into the water, hence they're called divers. And
So they'll disappear completely
they
under
would
the surface.
completely under the surface. Whereas the other birds that we brought, the dabblers, are designed to feed in 18 inches of water or less, and they just tip their bodies up in, and they're mostly vegetation feeders. Not that you won't see, I've seen mallards eating zebra mussels off of vegetation, and even had a co-worker describe one of them swallowing a crayfish. So
Really?
they're opportunistic, yes.
The shallow water ducks?
Right.
Oh, no kidding.
It was a mallard. And, often your dabblers are more colorful, at least the drakes are, the males, and because they have their breeding plumage, they're showing off for the females and displaying, trying to attract mates.
Right.
And the most common one that we see is the mallard. Everybody sees them in the parks. You see them a lot in the flyway, and they have a lot of beautiful colors, iridescent greens and blues on the heads and the orange feet, and they get more of a yellowish bill, kind of a greenish yellow. And then the speculum on the wing, they have a nice purple that shows in the light, and two white wing bars. And they get, a lot of people have noticed they get the curls on the bottom of them. But they feed mostly on vegetation. As I said, their bills are designed to kind of pick up seeds, both agricultural and native seeds like smartweed and nutsedge and things like that.
So it looks like more of a broader and a wider bill and a longer bill than your divers?
Correct, much broader. And it depends on the size of the bird. These are more are smaller divers, whereas if you handled a canvasback, it would be large like a mallard, such as this. And then I brought a female one just to show the difference. They're much more of a drab camouflage color because they're higher chance of nest predation. They're on the nest incubating for 28 days. They have a larger chance of being killed by something like a fox or an owl. I mean, everything loves to eat ducks, and they're you see that. I watched 2 weekends ago. I had my son out on youth weekend, and we watched a peregrine falcon take a shorebird. So I mean, and like I said, that's the only second time I've ever seen that. So
part of the food chain.
It is. It's part of the food chain and part of the system. So, and you can see it's hard to see on these mounts, but their feet are a little further up on the body than a diving duck, and that helps them tip up. So that you see that you see the duck's rear end feathers up in the air, and they're feeding on something down below there. And that they're also very adapted to sifting out insects. The hen targets those invertebrates during the springtime, especially because what they have is exoskeleton. The shell on them is nothing but calcium, and that's good for them. For the insect has protein, the calcium, and the insect helps them form their eggs. So that's what they're looking for. So very.
How about when the young hatch? Is that a good part of their diet too, to have calcium in there?
It is, and they're feeding on insects as they go along, and that helps them grow faster. Because you think about it, these birds nest and lay their eggs in May. They're hatched out in June, and they're flying by the end of August because they have to leave the area, when snow flies, and they have to be in good shape. And we had some birds this weekend that were harvested that I looked at, and it was a drake mallard, and it was a hatchier bird, which means it was born this year. And we were able to age it and from the band return, and you couldn't tell the size difference at this point from an adult male.
Amazing growth rate, yeah.
They do very quickly. And the same with our migrating geese. They're up in the tundra of Canada, and they have to be out of there. Snow is starting to fly. They're going to be leaving and have to make that trip from the James and Hudson Bay area all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay twice a year. So it's a quick growth rate. So.
Good.
So another duck here that you have is very, very close and looks very much like a mallard, but it's dark. All underneath its belly, this is the comparison. You can see here the darkness, and that's the American black duck, another common bird in our area. And so it looks very much like a hen mallard.
A lot like it, yes.
Yep, but it has the dark underbelly instead of the light underbelly, such as the mallard has. And also, if you look at the wing, the colors on the wings, you just have that blue, purplish blue color on the speculum instead of the white lines, and that's one way you can tell them apart. And a lot of people get confused with these when they first start out IDing birds, but once you key into some of the characteristics of, you know, of the colors and you practice a little bit, they stand out. As long as you have good daylight, you can definitely I still have a hard time in the early morning light. If you don't get the right light, you have to definitely make sure what bird you're looking at. So that just comes with practice.
Well, that's a good tip for hunters too,
Yeah,
even beginning
if you're
hunters.
hunting.
Yeah,
Just, you know, learn your birds, try to get out with experienced people, and then with today, you don't just have the books, you have the internet. There's so many beautiful pictures on the internet that you can look
That's
at.
a good tip too, yeah. Very good. Yeah.
And then the last one that I brought was one of the most colorful birds out there. The king of the birds, many people call him, is the wood duck. Very common bird in Vermont. This is a drake. The female has just more of brown colors and has this nice white frosting on the primaries of its feathers. And they will have white eye-ring, but this is a wood duck, and they also nest in the trees. The other birds I showed you nest on the ground, so there's different predators and different ways of avoiding predators. But this bird is prized not only by duck hunters, but also by fly anglers because of the feathers. They use them to tie their flies. But that's
another good point. I'm glad you brought it up. I have a friend in Proctor who's not into hunting too much, but he's a great fly fisherman. And I'll save, once I skin a duck out, I'll save some of the feathers here, and also from the mallard, the male mallard.
Right. A lot of the vermiculation on the side is very prized, and that's one thing that you can also, when you have a bird in hand, it's hard to see in the air, but if you have one that isn't colored up yet because they're young and growing into it, if you see this vermiculation on the side, you know you have a male dabbling duck compared to a female. And also, it's not a diving duck.
One quick question: the curled feathers toward the tail, does that indicate an adult or?
No, it's more at the time of year and how they've grown into it. A lot of people look at those and think that's an adult. You will find these on hatchier birds just later in the year quite often. So, and then, you know, and also the color of the feet. They talk about, you know, those red legs coming down from Canada, and it's more just the stage that they're at. And
so it's kind of a myth in a way.
It is. You know, it's kind of So.
Great. Okay, Dave, I thought we'd spend our next few minutes here, we have a little bit of time left, on some of the decoys and some of the hunting strategies that are out there today. The first type of decoy I want to show you, and if you want to elaborate a little bit, it's called a silhouette decoy. Canada goose on that one and a snow goose here. I want to show those.
All right. I mean, decoys have been used over the centuries. You know, Native Americans used them to bring birds into their sets and to capture them. And this is what they call a silhouette decoy. It's very thin. Whereas you have shell decoys that show the full body almost of the animal and the set in the ground. But these are used to draw the bird into shooting range for hunters. And as what you have in front of you is a full body, which is, you know, something of the last probably 20 years, I think, they've been producing commercially in a plastic version. Some hunters used to make them out of what they called stuffers. They take birds that they had harvested and use the feathers to make a full body type decoy. And these are meant to bring the birds within, you know, 20, 30 yards of your decoys so that they can effectively harvest them with a shotgun. And I guess that's one thing it should be known, is that people are only allowed to use shotguns in certain sizes of shot to harvest the birds. They can't use rifles there. So, and as you said, you have the silhouette. And when the birds fly around, you know, and nowadays they're basically photographs that they've superimposed on a piece of material. In the past, people made them out of plywood and painted them. They used the colors, you know, for the birds. And so people are very creative with what they've used to make decoys and to bring the birds into them. And, you know, you've seen them made, some of the historic ones were just out of willows and wrapped together, and even out of burdocks and stuff together. Yeah, it's very impressive.
And here's another silhouette of the snow goose. And we'll try to put them side by side so you can see how realistic they really are there with the detail. This is an actual photograph, actually, of a.
And this is an adult bird too, which you can say there's, you know, some decoy spreads have the gray birds, the gray legs, and the gray body colors of a greater snow goose, and that's used just to tell the difference between age. But it's nice to have that mixed into your flock sometimes. But the white really shows out when it's on the ground and attracts the birds as they fly by.
You know, you brought up an important point a minute ago. Let's speak a little bit more about specific regs. You mentioned shotguns only for waterfowl.
Right.
what about the loads? In the old days, you used to be able to use lead.
Correct. Now there's a variety of what they call non-toxic shot. A lot of people, what they first came out with was steel shot, And when it first came out, it wasn't as effective as lead. It didn't have the mass, it didn't carry the energy. But now they have steel shots that are coated with copper, they have tungsten, they have bismuth, and they're always working with different formulations, and the shot is much more effective than it used to be. But yeah, you have to use non-toxic shot for waterfowl hunting, and that's the same, that's nationwide. And even on some of your national wildlife refuges for some of the upland game bird hunting, they require that on some of your areas. And there are, you can use up to a 10 gauge, that's the largest gauge. A common shotgun gauges that I see people using is usually a 20 gauge, sometimes a 16, but quite often the most common is a 12 gauge shotgun that the people use.
Yeah. I kind of graduated down. I used to be nothing but 12 gauge, but I found a 20 gauge to my liking a lot. This is a little Remington 1100 model. I actually got for my son many years ago when he was in middle school, and now that he's kind of flown out of the nest, I use it a lot. It's got an improved cylinder choke in the end, sometimes a modified, but I use 3-inch magnums in that, 1 1/16 ounce, which is pretty much pushing the envelope, but there's a new load that's been out a couple of years, and its name escapes me, but it's hexagonal shaped pellets. And I guess when they load them in a factory, they vibrate it toward the end, even get a little bit more squeezed in there. Yeah, it's really quite a blindside, it's called. And I've had really good luck on ducks and geese with those loads.
Yeah, it's really a personal preference. I mean, all my children, my daughter, my 2 sons, I started them out with a 20 gauge youth model, and then it's actually my wife's shotgun. And then they graduate up through to larger shotguns if they choose to. My daughter still enjoys the 20 gauge compared to the 12. And as you said, modified is a very common choke. The steel, it holds a different type of a pattern than the lead was, so you really have to pattern your shotguns and try different loads and even types of shotgun shells in your gun to make sure you have a good pattern with it. Because the steel does, they've included buffer now in the shots, but before it would bounce around quite a bit. So.
And that's a good point too, because each choke and actually each barrel may pattern differently, so it's really a good idea to get out and experiment with different loads.
Absolutely, it's just like people with their deer rifles. You want to make sure you're sighted in. You want to be very accurate and effective, so you have a nice clean kill on the animal. Now
on this model I showed a couple of minutes ago, we also are allowed only 3 shots per shotgun per capacity, 1 in the chamber, 2 in the tubular magazine underneath, and that even holds true for woodcock, which is a migratory bird. But anyway, on this, there's a plastic factory plug that came with it. So there's a big spring in here, and that factory plug will take up probably that much room. So it leaves about 6 inches left. So for your 2 3-inch mags, you'll have just enough space up there for that. And a quick field story. One time I was hunting with a colleague of yours, Mark Scott, and it was the opening morning, and he forgot his plug back at deer camp. So we used some Yankee ingenuity, cut off a corn stalk, which fit in there really well, and made sure it was about 5.5 to 6 inches long. And it worked. Slid it down through the big spring in there and put the cap back on. It worked fine. As long as you have something in there to prevent it from being more than 3 shots, you're okay.
And a lot of these rules and regulations, it's not meant to make it harder on hunters. It's meant for conservation. We want to utilize the resource and the birds, but we want to make sure there's enough for everybody to enjoy them and to have them into the future. And that's really the goal, is just to protect the birds into the future and make sure we have them.
No, that's a very good point too, Dave. I'll look at it in our closing minutes. I just want to go over a couple more types of decoys very quickly. Dave mentioned the silhouettes before and the full body decoys. And if that thing isn't a spitting image of the male mallard you have there.
Absolutely, you can compare that.
Close detail.
They've come a long ways with the commercial brands. You can look at the colors and even the texture on the plastic. Before it would just be a solid mold and have the basic colors in there. But with modern production, and I still love the old style decoys, a little bit of a traditionalist where people hand make them and they carve their own heads, and some of them are wood bodies, some are cork, but it's more of a tradition and a kind of a heritage thing that people like to watch. But that is just a beautiful decoy, and it needs to get a little mud on it and get it out into the water there so you can enjoy it.
That's right. No, they're very realistic. Well, Dave, we've got just a few seconds left. I thought in closing, I would just hope the audience enjoys this, the viewing audience. Get outside whenever you can, and by all means, take a kid out with you too. And that's one of the greatest classrooms going, really, is the great outdoors.
It is.
And I hope you enjoy this show, and our next show for November will be about probably the granddaddy of all hunting seasons in Vermont, which is the deer season. So we're going to have a couple hunting guests come in on that. So hunt safely out there, and we'll see you the next time.